Hello again, everybody. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. Once again, journalists are in the unhappy predicament of trying to decide whether and how to cover false allegations raised by a candidate for President of the United States. This time, in the midst of Donald Trump's attacks on the Clintons using various scandals and accusations from the 1990s, Mr. Trump has repeated an outrageous and long ago debunked falsehood about former Deputy White House counsel Vince Foster, a friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton's until his tragic suicide. In July 1993, Foster, who suffered from depression, drove to Fort Marcy Park in Virginia, walked into the park with an old revolver, and shot himself in the mouth. The Park Service police concluded that year that Foster committed suicide, but that did not stop conspiracy theorists at the time from concocting all sorts of unfounded allegations. Now, that first investigation was followed by an investigation by CNN in 1994 concluding Foster's death was due to suicide and that alternative scenarios had no credibility. Other investigations reached the same conclusion, one by independent counsel Robert Fisk in 1994, two by Congressional Reviews in 1994 and 1995, another by independent counsel Ken Starr in 1997. So one would think, case closed, right? Wrong. Donald Trump, in an interview appearing in today's Washington Post, called the circumstances surrounding Vince Foster's death, quote, very fishy, and said, I don't bring Foster's death up because I don't know enough to really discuss it. I will say there are people who continue to bring it up because they think it was absolutely a murder. I don't do that because I don't think it's fair, right? Except, of course, you just did that, Mr. Trump. You lent credence to a bizarre and unfounded conspiracy theory. Though you're right, it's not fair that you did that, certainly not to Mr. Foster's widow or their 3 children. To be clear, the notion that this was a murder is a fiction born of delusion and untethered to reality and contradicted by evidence reviewed in at least 6 investigations, one of them by Ken Starr, hardly a Bill Clinton defender. To say otherwise is ridiculous and, frankly, shameful. Again, this is not a pro-Clinton position or an anti-Trump position. It is a pro-truth position. CNN chief political correspondent Dana Bash joins me now. Now, Dana, to be clear, there are certainly questions to ask about Hillary Clinton or the Clintons, their business dealings, et cetera. But why? What's the strategy behind Mr. Trump raising not only the false charge against the Clintons about Vince Foster, but questions about Mr. Clinton's alleged actions in the 1990s? How would that impact his wife in 2016?
Well, the answer to that, according to a couple of Trump sources who I talked to this afternoon, and they argue that going back in time to the 90s may seem like old news to people who lived it, like the two of us, but for younger voters, especially female voters, who don't know that much about the Clinton years, Trump is hoping to sow seeds of doubt and do it in a way that few in politics, even the Clintons, have ever experienced before.
It is political guerrilla warfare.
Hillary Clinton's husband abused women more than any man that we know of in the history of politics, right?
A source familiar with Donald Trump's campaign strategy tells CNN that Trump dredging up tawdry, unproven allegations about Bill Clinton's past is not based on data or focus groups from his new pollster or his new partner, the Republican National Committee.
She's married to a man who hurt many women.
Instead, CNN is told this is vintage Trump, going with his gut and shooting from the hip, seething after seeing attacks about his own past statements about women, like this ad from a pro-Clinton super PAC.
Does she have a good body? No. Does she have a fat ass? Absolutely.
She attacked Mr. Trump as being a sexist, misogynist, and that's inaccurate. Donald Trump's not any of those things.
A challenge for Trump in attacking Bill Clinton as anti-woman and tagging Hillary as an enabler, his own past statements of support. Like in 1998, in the midst of Bill Clinton's scandal with Monica Lewinsky.
Can you imagine how controversial that'd be? You think about him with the women. How about me with the women?
Even 10 years later, in 2008.
Look at the trouble Bill Clinton got into with something that was totally unimportant. and they tried to impeach him, which was nonsense.
Here's how a longtime Trump confidant explained his 180.
He said he was a private citizen who was friendly with the Clintons, and he was trying to protect a friend. All right, now it's a different game.
And then there are conspiracy theories, like the false charge that Bill Clinton's White House counsel, Vince Foster, was murdered, despite multiple investigations ruling it a suicide. Trump told the Washington Post Foster's death was, quote, very fishy, but said, I will say there are people who continue to bring it up because they think it was absolutely a murder. I don't do that because I don't think it's fair. Even that feeds the 2016 campaign conversation, which Bill Clinton himself clearly saw coming, saying this just last week.
You think the stuff they said about her is bad? They accused me of murder. I mean, our memories are short. It's what they do.
As for Hillary Clinton, so far she's letting others do the responding, which the first female House Speaker told CNN is the way to go.
Hillary's doing exactly what I think. Don't stoop to that level, really.
Some sources close to Clinton are urging her not to take what they call Trump's bait.
That's exactly what he is fishing for, and, you know, I'm not going to be responding.
A veteran Clinton supporter told me today that if Clinton engages, she is simply going to be agreeing to turn the campaign into an insult fest. But, Jake, I spoke to a couple of other Democratic supporters of Hillary Clinton who said maybe it is time for her to at least show a bit of her human side, that she did have a very, very tough time as a wife during the 90s, during this big scandal, and that maybe talking a bit about that will help to not just change the conversation, but to make her again look more human and less political.
All right, Dana Bash, thanks so much. Joining me more to talk about this new line of attack, Washington Post reporter Dan Balls, Trump senior advisor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and former Clinton White House communications director and longtime Hillary Clinton advisor Ann Lewis. Sarah, let me start with you. This afternoon, Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid said that Mr. Trump was trying to distract from his own record by attacking the Clintons this way. Take a listen.
If any one of us were Donald Trump, wouldn't you try to divert attention from all he's done to show how desperate he is? He brought up yesterday the suicide of Foster. Here's a man who committed suicide. There's no question about that. But that's not enough for Donald Trump. Even though suicide is a tragedy, it's not a tragedy for Donald Trump.
A little context there. Senator Reid's father committed suicide, so this might hit home a little closer than normal, perhaps. But in any case, Sarah, how do you respond to what Senator Reid had to say?
Look, I think when you're Donald Trump and you've been hit really hard by a lot of false allegations on the front page of the New York Times, you have a right to fight back and to defend yourself. And there's a completely double standard in this process and in this campaign between Donald Trump and the Clintons. Donald Trump has false allegations against him from 30 years ago, and it's front page of the New York Times. But no one is talking about any of this stuff from the Clintons' past, and they're getting away scot-free. And so I think it's a very big double standard, and Donald Trump is the only one talking about it, and he has to, because he's getting hit day after day after day with millions of dollars in negative ads on issues like this by the Clinton campaign. They've brought this up. They've kind of started this fight, and he's going to fight back. And I think he has a right to do that.
Ann Lewis, your response?
Well, we have seen this before. You know, this is a return to the not-so-golden times of the 90s. Republicans tried this before in the 90s. They tried using a campaign of personal attacks over and over, and the result was that in 1998, Democrats won a historic record of seats in that congressional election. Now, fast forward. We're now in 2016. The candidate is Hillary Clinton, not Bill Clinton. The office is President of the United States. People look at those votes very seriously. Hillary Clinton is going to go on doing what she's been doing. She's going to talk about what this election means for your family, for your community, for our country. If Donald Trump wants to keep throwing out, or I guess using discredited old conspiracy theories, it's not going to work.
Dan, let me bring you in.
Can I just jump in here real quick, Jake? I would love for this race to be about exactly what Ann said, and that is on the issues, because if you put that contrast of Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton, he's going to win every single time. In a time where national security is a major focus, we've seen failure after failure from the Clintons and Secretary Clinton, and so I absolutely would love to see this campaign be about the economy, be about national security, because if that's the contrast, Donald Trump will beat Hillary Clinton every day of the week.
Well, Dan, let me bring you in. You remember the 90s as well as I do. It was a period of nasty personal attacks, conspiracy theories, not to say that none of the charges were true, obviously, but a lot of these attacks, as Ann just pointed out, ended up, politically speaking, actually backfiring. It's very uncommon for a president's party to win congressional seats in the middle of the second term, and he did. What do you think might happen now? Is it a completely new era?
Well, it's a new era in a lot of different ways. I mean, we're in an era in which communication is much different than it was back in the 90s. And Donald Trump clearly is more of a master of that than the other politicians he's faced, and we'll see whether he's more of a master of it than Hillary Clinton. They obviously are going to have totally different strategies in how they communicate with the American people. As Ann said, Secretary Clinton wants to try to talk about certain particular issues, what she would do for middle-class Americans, et cetera, and so forth. Donald Trump is going to continue to say and do outrageous things. It is the way he gets attention. It is the way he distracts from other issues. I think one of the calculations inside the Trump campaign is, yes, he has high negatives, but they're going to do everything they can to make sure that her negatives continue to stay high or perhaps go even higher. And so they're going to try different things. The Vince Foster, what he had to say about that, as you said yesterday, is totally false. Yeah. And yet he will continue to try to do those things. He'll move from target to target as a way of being, distracting from the things that she wants to do.
Sarah, let me ask you, writing in Dan's newspaper, The Washington Post, Chris Cillizza wrote, quote, "There's an argument whereby what Trump is doing makes perfect political sense. There is no family that Republicans distrust and dislike more than Bill and Hillary Clinton. It's literally impossible for Trump to say or do anything related to the Clintons that would send Republican voters scurrying from him. In fact, what Trump is doing, an aggressive airing of the Clintons' dirty laundry, is exactly what many Republicans have been wishing their leaders would do for a long time." Cillizza's argument, Sarah, is basically that this is going to be an election of Democrats and Republicans trying to turn out their bases. Is that the thinking here? Is that the strategy?
I think we're absolutely have to turn out our base, but I think Donald Trump is going beyond that because he's bringing new people into the fold, and he's going much further and putting states in play that haven't been on the board for Republicans in a long time. And I think in large part, in particular, it's not just because it's the year of the outsider, and he is by far the ultimate outsider. Hillary Clinton is the ultimate insider, and so you have this very distinct contrast between two candidates that couldn't be more different. A guy who's never been in Washington, never been in politics, versus somebody who spent their entire life in that. And so I think that that's absolutely what's taking place. It's not just about the base, though, but expanding the base for Donald Trump and putting states on the board that haven't been probably in the last couple of decades for Republicans.
And let me ask you, is there any evidence that you know of that suggests that launching these attacks, even if they're based on complete falsehoods like the Vince Foster attack, that will hurt him? We haven't seen him hurt in any way from any of the outrageous and non-traditional campaign steps he makes.
But actually, if you look at the votes, if you look at the polling, and if you look at the opinion that American women have of Donald Trump, and here I am referring to the majority of the election, as Sarah says, there are differences in policies. That's right. When Donald Trump talks about punishing women who've had abortions, when Donald Trump talks about rolling back gun-free zones, and Hillary Clinton is out there talking about how do we invest in our communities, how do we raise the minimum wage, those are real differences in policies. And the result has been that American women, by a sizable margin, are supporting Hillary Clinton and have a very negative opinion of Donald Trump.
All right, Dan Ball, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and Ann Lewis, thank you one and all. Appreciate it. Hillary Clinton already fending off attacks from Donald Trump, but she still cannot shake her Democratic rival, Senator Bernie Sanders. And now Sanders is even saying that the Democratic convention in Philadelphia could get, quote, messy. What did he mean by that? That story next.
One of the most ominous of all inconsistencies involves Bill Clinton's conflicting versions of his final conversation with Foster. When first asked, Clinton said he couldn't remember when he last spoke with Foster or what was discussed. When he was asked a second time, he claimed he spoke with Foster Sunday night, 2 days before his death. Clinton redrafted his story a third time, changing the date of his call to Monday, the night before Foster's death. According to Time magazine, at this point, Clinton still maintained he was unaware of Foster's depression. When the White House press office announced depression as the reason behind Foster's suicide, Clinton then redrafted a fourth version, claiming the purpose of this call was to cheer up his friend. The question becomes not if Clinton lied, but why he lied. Within minutes of the verification of Foster's identity, the Park Police issued orders to seal Foster's office at the White House. David Watkins, Clinton's administrative assistant, assured the police he would take care of it. He lied.
Instead of sealing Foster's office, you asked Watkins to do it. Now, it is my understanding you called Watkins the night of Foster's death and asked him to do this, and he said he would.
As I said, before I left the notification scene, I asked for him to ensure that that was done.
But he didn't.
Immediately, high-ranking members of Bill and Hillary's staff began ransacking Foster's office, removing important and possibly incriminating documents. The people entering the office included Bernard Nussbaum, counsel to the president, Patsy Thomason, White House administration director, and former assistant to cocaine distributor Dan Lassiter, and Margaret Williams, Hillary Clinton's chief of staff.
Why was the office not sealed until 11 a.m. the next morning? Did Bernie Nussbaum, Patsy Thomason, and Maggie Williams know about the order not to go in there because it was supposed to be sealed? And how did they learn in the first place about Vince Foster's death? Did somebody order Nussbaum, Thomason, and Williams to search Vince Foster's office? Or did one of them make the decision to search the office?
The first thing that any agency conducting an investigation of a man in that position should have done is seal his car, seal his office, and seal his home until a thorough search was made. People went in and ransacked his office, absconded with documents, which is a felony to interfere in the conduct of a federal investigation, even an incompetent one. And no one seems to care.
The Park Police were not allowed access to those papers. The FBI was not allowed access to those papers. The Secret Service was not allowed access to those papers. Instead, 8 or 9 attorneys on the White House personnel went in ahead.
And those people should be brought to task for it. And they should be subpoenaed, put under oath, and with the threat of prosecution of tampering with a crime scene, they should be forced to explain why they did it, who ordered them to do it, and what they did with the evidence.
On April 22nd, 1994, Hillary Clinton stated she had no knowledge of the raid on Foster's office.
Why did your chief of staff, Maggie Williams, why was she not know to remove the documents from his office within days of death?
I don't think that she did remove any documents.
At the Whitewater hearings, Margaret Williams stated under oath that Hillary had ordered her to bring files taken from Foster's office that night to her. Either Williams is guilty of perjury, or Hillary is guilty of obstruction of justice, as well as lying to the American people.
On Mrs. Clinton's instructions, I believe, she took them to the private quarters, the Clinton's quarters at the White House, where they were kept for safety. And if it was done on Mrs. Clinton's orders, that could involve her in the obstruction of justice.
Now, 2 days later, evidently they didn't get everything out of there they wanted, because on July 22nd, 1993, Mr. Nussbaum and other White House officials went into Mr. Foster's office a second time. The FBI agents and the Park Police were ordered to sit on chairs out in the hall while the White House staff went through these documents. And Mr. Nussbaum gave the FBI and the Park Police no indication of what he was taking. One FBI agent stood up to look in the room, and he was reprimanded and told to sit down.
Again, I just want to, we didn't search. Again, we're told to sit down, and I'm not sure how many people were there, 8 to 11 maybe, White House personnel, who searched the office for reasons of national security, I guess, and decided what would be able for us to be looked at. And then that material was turned over to the family attorney. And after he had it for a day or so, then we were allowed to look at it.
The raid on Foster's office was kept secret for 5 months until the Washington Times broke the story in December of 1993. The White House then announced that Whitewater files had been taken from Foster's office. The White House had intentionally directed the media's and the public's attention towards Whitewater, an area the Clintons felt they could handle.
When this is all over, it's going to be the same story we've been telling for 2 years. We made a bad investment, we lost money, and there's really not much more to add to it.
At the same time, the attention was diverted away from more serious secrets, which Foster's office may have held.
I believe they were frightened to death that if a proper investigation was conducted, it would disclose improper actions of people in the White House back in Arkansas, events that Vince Foster had knowledge of, and the White House may have participated in a cover-up of its own, separate from the murder, simply to keep a series of nasty events involving laundered money and covert operations down in Mena, Arkansas, from becoming public. The Arkansas National Guard, when Bill Clinton was governor, was deeply involved in covert operations down in Mena, Arkansas, and Bill Clinton was their commander. And there is strong indications that some of the laundered money from these covert operations wound up being laundered through the Arkansas Treasury and through ADFA. And Vince Foster would have been close enough to that as the confidant of the president that the trail of the motive for someone killing him would have probably led back to Little Rock.
The raid on Foster's office and the ensuing Whitewater scandal led to calls for a special prosecutor to investigate. Robert Fisk was chosen, although his previous ties to Clinton were never made public.
Robert Fisk Law Firm represented the company that sold the land to Bill Clinton's Whitewater Partnership. What's more, Robert Fisk also worked with President Clinton's lawyer in the Paula Jones sexual harassment case, Robert Bennett. They worked together in a case involving the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, also known as BCCI. BCCI was a scandal-plagued $10 billion bank failure that has been implemented and alleged wrongdoing involving the Arkansas phase of Whitewater, which Robert Fisk has banned us from even talking about here today.
Fisk proceeded to collect massive volumes of testimony and documents, making sure the public was never made aware of their content. Meanwhile, the Rose Law Firm in Arkansas was busy shredding Vince Foster's files.
Jeremy Hedges, a part-time courier at the Rose Law Firm, told a grand jury that he was told to shred documents from the files of Vince Foster after Special Prosecutor Robert Fisk had announced he would look into Foster's death. That's impeding justice. Wouldn't Vince Foster's former colleagues at the firm want to cooperate in every way with an investigation into their friend's death? Wouldn't Bill and Hillary want to?
Can you tell us what you know about stories about shredding of Whitewater documents down in Arkansas?
Nothing.
At the gubernatorial mansion?
Oh, that didn't happen, and I know nothing about any other such stories.
You don't know anything about documents relating to Whitewater ever shredded anywhere that you know about or authorized or didn't authorize?
Absolutely not.
The American people's outrage over the escalating cover-ups resulted in Washington, D.C. being inundated with calls to hold congressional hearings. Every possible attempt to block or delay the hearings was made. Finally, they were allowed to go forward on the condition that no relevant information be presented to the American people.
Evening, guys.
let's start with Trump calling the Vince Foster suicide very fishy. Let me start by saying this. When I went back to D.C. years and years ago, it was at a time when there were a lot of floods. It really rained hard back there. And I went back by train, and then my buddy came out the next day. So anyway, I get there, and I spent the first day by myself walking around. And my buddy, who's a math teacher at a major college, he said to me, he goes, "Martin, you realize you walked like 16 miles? No. At the end of the day, I walked up the steps of the Capitol, and I was trying to find Fort Marcy Park. And so I said to this guard, I said, could you, and I have my map out, I said, could you please tell me where I could find Fort Marcy Park? And I kid you not, the guy said, why? Did you want to see where Vince Foster was shot? I was a little taken aback. I mean, I knew he had been murdered. There was no question about that. But I feigned it, and I said, oh, you mean he didn't commit suicide? And the guy goes like this, just rolls his eyes. Now, that was basically the beginning of my week. The rest of my week was pretty much the same. People were very honest, upfront with about everything. But that really started it off on quite the roll. I had had a couple of other encounters that day with people, but that one really set the tone. In other words, folks, everybody in D.C. knew that Vince Foster had been murdered. I won't go into the details of how his body was found and everything else. I will tell you this. His two kids said, that's not Dad's gun. And Hillary, right when his body was found, she had two guards, two Secret Service guys, protect the room while she rifled through everything in Vince Foster's office. That's a little bit illegal. Okay, that's a lot illegal. And for that alone, she should go to jail. In other words, what I'm saying is this. Donald Trump, by pushing all these buttons, they may be old buttons, but you know something? They need to be brought out. She needs to be prosecuted. So does Bill Clinton. For everything. And I mean everything. We're not, I mean, Grant, I'm well aware we're not going to get them on everything. But you know something? The bottom line is, she and Bill and Chelsea do not ever, well, her and Bill don't belong out of jail ever. They belong in jail forever, along with the Obamas. Bushes as well. Anyway, moving on to U.S. prosecutors. For the guy that murdered all those people in, I believe it was South Carolina, in the church, they're going to seek the death penalty. As well they should. God, that guy was a punk. What a rotten piece of shit. You know, I mean, I won't say it. Moving on. Paul Ryan. He gets a big win for himself. I'm sure he's home, getting happy. And bipartisan deal with the Puerto Rico deal. So we bail out Puerto Rico. You know, it's not their money, right? We need to make it their money. You know, if it was their money going down the tubes, whoa, they would think twice about that. Vets not being allowed to adopt their dogs. They said they could. It was empty promises. And you know, you're like, so what? Big deal. You know something? These dogs oftentimes saved their life and the lives of other people. Not cool. Not cool at all. A transgender teacher in Oregon at a middle school gets $60,000 because they didn't call him by the right pronoun. That shit will come to an end. I guarantee it. It will come to an end. And don't think that it won't. As I've always told you, We've gone this hard left. We're going to go hard right. We're going to see people going to jail that we never thought would go to jail. And we're going to see things undone that are just too stupid, like the bathroom thing. I mean, how freaking insane. Sweden, they're waking up to the horror of Islam. The rapes, the murders, the thefts, everything. They could deny it for a long time, but and I'm sure a lot of people by the 80s, they saw the handwriting on the wall, and it just got worse and worse. It is a horror show over there. It's a horror show in Sweden, Germany, France, Denmark, Netherlands, all over. Pope cozying up to the Sunni Imam. There's no question he's a friend of Islam. And the bizarre part is, if they had the chance, they would cut his head off. But in his case, he wouldn't know the difference. And he'd just keep walking around. His brains are all in his ass. In his asshole, that's his eyeball. Cyclops. You just never know what you're going to get, you know? Colorado. Apparently, we finally gave in to the EPA with the, I told you yesterday they have 2 secret meetings every year to divvy up billions and billions of dollars of the slush fund. Well, apparently Colorado's going to get some of that money for the gold mine disaster that they created. That's right, the EPA created it. I cannot wait for Trump to do away with the EPA. Or at least put it down into such a small amount they can't do any harm. NYPD. There's a guy that was wearing a Carhartt jacket. They did kill him, but it took some bullets. Now, either the jacket is bulletproof, and by the way, we sold Carhartt jackets over here. They're great jackets, but they're not bulletproof, okay? And basically, the NYPD officer, I think he was just a shitty shot. Veterans. This was all staged. Here's a bunch of veterans, supposedly, standing with their Muslim veterans. I think it was all staged. I don't know of any veterans that would stand with the Muslims. I don't know of any, period. Chelsea starter home, $6 million. I shit you not. That's her beginning home. I want that whole family behind bars. I really do. Not because she started out with a $6 million home, but because she's rotten and crooked just like her mom and daddy. Center boxer. They're trying to say she used this finger. No, she used this finger. It's pretty clear. You have to be blind as a bat not to see that one. And she was frightened. I would have laughed my ass off if the Bernie Sanders supporters had grabbed that bitch and taken her down. Oh, I would have laughed. Because it's always the far right that are so violent, right? In truth, the far left are way more violent. Health and Human Services. The same day the dumbass released that thing to the education, all the schools. Well, Health and Human Services released a memo, a similar one, for federally funded hospitals. And they said, if you don't perform sex change operations, then you're going to lose your funding. This is not the America that I was born into, I can tell you that. And when Obama said he was going to fundamentally change America, we had no idea what he really meant. Nobody did, except for those on the inside. They knew that Congress would never get in his road. They knew they had the Congress bought off. It's not that they lack the will. It's not that they're stupid. Well, they are stupid. They are corrupt. And that's the whole problem. They're really corrupt and inept. But they're mostly just corrupt. They're bought off. Venezuela. This is so Obama-like. The president down there told the beer maker, Polar, They make 80% of all the beer sold in Venezuela. He says, either you make beer or you're going to jail. Okay, there's just one problem here. They can't buy the hops because they can't get the American currency to buy the hops with. So the president is saying, I'm going to take over your operation. Yeah, and do what? I mean, the guy is so dumb. They need to take him out and just shoot his ass. Hillary, she wants a 500% increase of Muslims in America. And Trump is coming down on her, and rightfully so. He said, you don't care about women. You don't care about children. And she doesn't. That's because she's half man. Did I say that out loud? Yes, I did. Bill Cosby. You know, the more you find out about him, he was such a dog. I mean, he admitted this one modeling agency would send him 5 or 6 girls every week. Every week. And he would give them Quaaludes and stuff. You know, but the thing is, though, why did no one report him sooner? I mean, he paid them off to be quiet. But how is it, why is it that they're just now all of a sudden coming out? I mean, I granted, better late than never. But who the hell did he piss off? Anyway, that's all for now, guys. I'm going to go grab a shower, mowed the lawn today, and set up the pump, watered it afterwards, watered some of my plants out there. I got the white flies. They're gone. And I know one of the people said use Dawn soap. You know something? I just wanted them gone last night. I wasn't going to go in and get some. I just used the triazicide. And then I got some other stuff from Ortho today. They are dead. I sprayed all around. There are no more white flies to bother my grapes anymore. Anyway, that's all for now. God bless y'all. Have a great day. Bye-bye, guys.
Can you hear me? Is this working?
It's just for C-SPAN.
Oh, I see. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Morton. I'm the managing editor of the National Weekly Edition of the Washington Times. We're here today to hear from Chris Ruddy, author of the new book published by the Free Press, which is entitled The Strange Death of Vince Foster, an Investigation. Chris was born in Long Island, New York, the son of a police officer. He earned his master's degree from the London School of Economics, and he taught for several years in the New York City school system. So in more ways than one, then, Chris is a survivor. He, in 1991, started a monthly newspaper called the New York Guardian, and on the strength of several exclusives that he wrote for that newspaper, he attracted the attention of the New York Post and was hired on there as an investigative reporter. Chris is currently an investigative reporter for the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review and a media fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University. To set the stage for our author today, let me just review some recent history. Deputy White House Counsel Vince Foster had already been dead 5 months when on December 20, 1993, the Washington Times published a front-page story about Whitewater documents having been removed from Vince Foster's office on the night of his death. The subsequent uproar, which some of you may remember, led to the appointment of an independent counsel, and it also renewed interest in the mystery surrounding the death of Vince Foster. Now, most of this interest, I don't need to tell you, was circulating in Washington, D.C., but not on the airwaves or in print. When Chris Ruddy took up his investigation in early 1994, he became the first and only American newspaper man to aggressively pursue the story. Washington is a city that produces many official reports, and it would take a few thousand reporters probably just to keep track of all of them. I've got to say that I'm afraid that that may be one reason why millions of readers around the country are going to sleep when they read the press. But the latest of several official reports on the death of Vince Foster has just recently been released by Kenneth Starr, who had spent more than 3 years going over the same ground as his predecessor, Robert Fisk, who released a Fisk report on the death of Vince Foster. The Fisk report had in turn been necessitated because of problems inherent in the Park Police report, the original report about the death of Vince Foster. The man whose straightforward but relentless reporting forced the seemingly unending rewrite of the official reports is our guest today. We hear from the Free Press that the strange death of Vince Foster, an investigation, is selling briskly and, in fact, is quite close to making the bestseller list. This, despite the fact that there has been very little promotional effort on behalf of the book. Syndicated columnist Tom Sowell, Paul Craig Roberts, and Brent Bozell, also Arnold Beichman, have all written columns about the book. And the book has also been reviewed favorably by the New York Sunday Times. Tom Sowell in his column mentioned that the Ruddy book is no conspiracy theory, just disturbing facts that can't be swept under the rug. Arnold Beichman wrote that the Ruddy book proved that there was a cover-up of significant proportions. According to the New York Times, this book is the St. Mark's version of the Foster cover-up. Former New York City Mayor Ed Koch has praised the reporting of Chris Ruddy. The former FBI Director William Sessions had this to say about the book. Christopher Ruddy has detailed a significant array of facts and issues involving the death of Mr. Foster. His work is serious and compelling. While enduring great criticism, he has tenaciously argued a persuasive case that the American public has not been told the complete facts of this case. Mr. Ruddy has carefully avoided drawing undue inferences about the death. His reporting raises serious concerns about the handling of the Foster case. It is legitimate to question the process employed by authorities to make their conclusion. I would just like to point out to our viewing audience that the book, The Strange Death of Vince Foster, an Investigation, is available at most bookstores. Join me now, please, in welcoming Mr. Christopher Ruddy.
Well, I'd like to thank Robert Morton for that introduction. In fact, I'm very honored that Robert Morton would even introduce me at such an important gathering. Robert has been not only a friend for many years, but a model for me in terms of integrity and journalistic professionalism. So again, I'm quite honored that he would introduce me. And I'm very honored that all of you would come out to hear me have a little discussion about my book, The Strange Death of Vince Foster. And the title, I think, is sort of mimics a bestseller that appeared in the 1930s. I think we were all too young to remember that one. But it was called The Strange Death of President Harding, and asked various questions about not only the death of President Harding, but the suspicious death of a number of people in his administration at the time. Last week, independent counsel Kenneth Starr issued his report, his long-awaited report on the death of Vincent Foster. And I guess it's only appropriate that we would meet at such an important time. And I think the purpose of Starr's report was to hopefully put an end to the matter. Some people would also cynically say that the report, which he did not have to release, and the judges did not have to release, was an attempt, of course, to dampen interest in my book, because I come to some very different conclusions than Ken Starr does. Not suggesting that Foster was murdered. Starr says he was committed suicide, but I suggest, as I'll detail in my speech today, that there has been a cover-up of the death, and that the facts about the death, including the fact that Starr claims Foster died in Fort Marcy Park, is still open to question. It took Kenneth Starr $30 million and 3 years to reach a conclusion we have been repeatedly told by the major media was nothing more than an obvious suicide. Now, any police officer will tell you this, that in a normal case of a homicide investigation involving an apparent suicide, or even a homicide case of a murder, it should only take a week or two to open and close the case. It shouldn't take, and typically it doesn't take longer than a few weeks, $30 million in 3 years. So you might say to yourself, why has it taken that long? And I would suggest that the problem has been, the vexing problem has been the many facts of the case that disagree with the official findings, but the fact that those facts have found their way into the minds of many Americans. Times CNN did a poll during the course of the Starr investigation, and the poll found that 2/3 of Americans had not accepted the conclusion that Vince Foster committed suicide. 20% of Americans at that time believed Foster was murdered. So what are we talking about? Almost 50-60 million Americans believed that the late Deputy White House counsel was murdered on July 20th, 1993. I think that's a pretty significant dent in the population of the public. So I think what Starr had to do, and what all the official investigations had to do, was go through the motions to give the appearance of thoroughness of an investigation rather than conduct a thorough investigation, which would have closed the matter and maybe given some very different results than what they came up with. The best evidence that they did not engage in a thorough investigation is that despite all the questions and problems in this case, they have yet to conduct a second autopsy on Vincent Foster. This is even critically important, more so because you have a case where you have a number of witnesses say there were additional wounds on Foster's head inconsistent with suicide. You have a situation where the x-rays in this high-ranking official's death are missing, even though the government claimed originally they were taken. Dr. Cyril Wecht is one of the nation's most prominent pathologists, and I quote him and detail his involvement in the Foster case in the book. He is also a very prominent Democrat in the state of Pennsylvania. He ran for the Senate there. He also, when my first stories about this death were raised in the New York Post, he was handling inquiries about the death for the White House. They were referring all the calls to him. So I guess it was only natural that when the Senate committee, Banking Committee, investigated Foster's death in the spring and summer of 1994, they turned to Wecht as one of the people to review the autopsy findings. They never attached Dr. Wecht's statements and findings to their report, interestingly enough. But Dr. Wecht has stated publicly that he said that there definitely needed to be a second autopsy, that he would not himself sign off on any conclusions until there was one, and that he had never seen a case, let alone for a high official, a case where it was so bungled for an investigation of a death of this nature. The problem with Starr's report and the argument of my book, one of the main arguments of my book, is the problem with all the other investigations that have taken place. The Park Police, Special counsel Robert Fisk later comes in to investigate the case after questions were raised by myself and others. There's been a presumption all along that Vincent Foster died of a suicide. And we are told that we should take this, or we were told originally that we should take the fact that he committed suicide as almost a matter of faith. Now, I believe faith should be saved for religion, and that deaths should be the domain of evidence and crime scenes. But what we saw here was a belief that because this involved the president and the White House as an institution, there shouldn't be really a lot of tough questions asked. In fact, the Park Police determined that it was a suicide, and I have the evidence in my book, the testimony of sworn detectives of the Park Police. They determined Vince Foster committed suicide before any detective went to the scene to view the body. This gives new meaning to the term psychic police investigators. You know, I argue that, in fact, the first police officer on the scene who had never seen a suicide gunshot before, he admitted that to me, he radioed in without even having seen the gun in Foster's hand. He said he never saw the gun in Foster's hand, that it was a suicide. The detectives arrived at the scene and said, we determined it was a suicide before we went up to see the body. There was disturbing evidence, and this is how I sort of come into the story, and I really had no doubts about this case. I just thought there were loose ends that needed to be tied up when I came to Washington in January of 1994 and met with some of the paramedics and police that were first in the death scene. And I was shocked to find out that some of them indeed had grave reservations about this death. And my book sort of starts with the paramedics first at the death scene. Now let's put this in perspective. These paramedics did not know Vince Foster was a White House official when they saw the body initially. They did not know any ties this man had to Bill Clinton. They were looking at it straight as medical people, as people that had seen violent gunshot wound deaths. And I was disturbed to find out and later have confirmed that, in fact, some of them believed that Foster had been murdered. At least two of them officially indicated that it was not suicide and that it had been a homicide. This is very serious. Now, why did they think it was? And I think all the paramedics agreed that there were three initial problems with the crime scene, cursory review of the crime scene. One was the gun was still found in Vince Foster's hand. After the explosive recoil of the gun, the kick of the gun, any homicide detective will tell you the gun should not fall neatly at your side next to your hip. And yet you had this situation where the gun was still in the hand. Secondly, they noticed that Foster's body was neatly composed, that his arms were at his side as he was lying on the side of a slope in the park. His head was perfectly straight up, the gun in the hand. This was very unusual for a gunshot wound of a violent nature. The body should have looked disturbed, and it appeared to them, to at least two of them, that the body had been placed there, and as they both said, it looked as if it was, quote, ready for a coffin. And the third most probably apparent thing, that interpretation of the crime scene, which I think is one of the most vexing problems for the investigators, is the fact there was little blood observed when they viewed the body. If Foster had shot himself when he was alive, there should have been massive blood loss, typical of a gunshot wound to the head. The head is engorged with blood. In fact, they all saw a trickle out of the mouth and the nose. And it was an indication to them that Foster had not died, and to two New York City homicide experts that come into the case later to look at it independently, and I detail their findings in my book, that in fact Foster may not have died of the gunshot. They would examine to see why his heart had stopped first. And they would examine, they said, issues of whether he had been poisoned or not, or died of some other means. The problems of the crime scene should have been compounded, and those were just a few. There are many, many more as the investigation went on in the days after Foster's death. But those were all compounded now by the belief of Foster's friends and family and business or colleagues, professional colleagues at the White House, that he had not committed suicide, or they found it unbelievable that he had committed suicide. In fact, as I detail in the book, and I confirm in the book, on the night of Vince Foster's death, Webster Hubbell was calling people back in Little Rock on his cell phone as he was wandering around the Foster's Georgetown home, indicating to them that Foster had been murdered, that his death had been a result of foul play, and to tell them it was not suicide. In fact, I spoke to Phil Carroll, a senior partner of Foster's and Hubbell's at the Rose Law Firm, and Carroll told me yes, and that everybody at the time believed it, that it was inconceivable that Vincent Foster, the man the President of the United States said was the Rock of Gibraltar, would kill himself. Foster's wife and family told the Park Police that night, according to their own notes and recollections, that there was no evidence of depression. All of Foster's associates, when they're finally interviewed by the Park Police in the days after the death at the White House, Bernie Nussbaum, his secretary Betsy Pond, and Debbie Gorham, all indicated they noticed nothing unusual about his appearance or his behavior in the days before his death or on the day of his death. Later, of course, I argue in the book, the White House, with probably the backing of the White House, there's a creation of a story that Foster was depressed. Foster was the highest official to die since the death of President Kennedy 30 years ago under violent and suspicious circumstances. And yet, the Park Police were put in charge of this high-ranking official's death. The FBI was kept out of the death investigation itself, was subjugated to a window dressing role where they didn't conduct any of the important aspects of the case. So you had a White House that 2 months earlier was begging for the FBI to come in and to investigate the travel office employees because the White House wanted to go after them and get rid of them and put their own cronies and award their own contracts in the travel office. You have the death of the president's best friend under very mysterious circumstances, and in fact, they want to keep the FBI out of the inquiry. And what I think here really happens is that the White House takes control of a death investigation and engages in one of the most serious abuse of powers in this country's history. And I think one that would make Watergate look like child's play, because at the end of the day, Watergate was a burglary, a third-rate burglary, and here you have a dead body. Even the New York Times, in a recent editorial, admitted that the White House engaged in cover-ups in the office matter, although they're still accepting the suicide verdict. Well, as one book reviewer put it, if they would rifle his files in his office, what would stop the White House from rifling his body? And of course, the question is, if they would cover up matters in the office, why would they not cover up matters in the death itself? The White House was controlling the investigations to the point they were even dictating the timing of the autopsy procedure, as I detail in the book. The morning after the death, the autopsy procedure had been scheduled for the following day, 2 days after the death, where there would be police officers from the crime scene who could assist the pathologist doing the autopsy. Sometime between 7 and 9 a.m. the day after the death, and I think it's a clear indication the White House was in full control of this case, they were telling the Park Police, cancel your scheduled appointment, you're going to have it on our timing. Within 2 hours later, at the offices of the Virginia Medical Examiner, there was an autopsy being conducted. A rather hasty autopsy, I might add. Usually they take 2 hours, no less, for a gunshot wound. This one was conducted in 1 hour. The Park Police have claimed in their own words in my book that they were pressured from the White House to close the case, that the pressure, as one police officer said, was enormous. No one would even comprehend what was going on. But I think that the Park Police shouldn't be let off the hook completely. People would say they bungled the case, the White House put the Keystone Cops in. I don't think I go that easy on the Park Police. When you see on critical aspects of their investigation evidence is missing or destroyed or contaminated, it raises the specter of cover-up. It's an indication that there actually was a cover-up. That how could the coincidence be on the key parts of disputed matters, evidence is missing. All the key crime scene photos are gone. They were taken on one roll of 35 millimeter film. The Park Police admit they were destroyed in the lab when they were underexposed in the Park Police photo labs. All the x-rays, which were in the police custody, have disappeared, even though the report said they were taken. Clothing was later contaminated. My book is entitled The Strange Death of Vincent Foster. It could also be entitled The Strange Death Investigations, because it's not really about an unsolved murder case, possible murder case, or an unsolved mystery of a suspicious death. It's about how the people that are sworn to uphold the law in this country did not do the job they were supposed to do to protect the rights not only of Vincent Foster, but in a very clear way, all of our rights and civil liberties. And I think those investigations, sort of the failure of that comes to a very clear, comes to an understanding in the person of Robert Fisk, who was the first special counsel. There's an old saying among bureaucrats that policy is personnel, or personnel is policy, that if you pick the right people, you get the right results. And what we've seen here in all the different investigations is somebody has been picking the right people to get the right results. The Park Police were picked over the FBI. Later, Fisk is picked, and then Kenneth Starr, and Starr makes a number of picks, which we'll discuss, that seemingly have no interest in getting to the bottom of the case. Fisk was not even an independent counsel. Robert Fisk masqueraded as an independent counsel. Now, this is, I think, one of the most incredible things of my book, is here you have a man, a former prosecutor from New York, that comes in, says he's here to uphold the law to investigate the Clintons. Now, at the time he was appointed, there was no independent counsel law. Its authorization had lapsed. And there was such a hue and cry from Congress about some of these scandals that they decided they would appoint an interim special counsel. Janet Reno would make the appointment. Under the independent counsel law, the appointment's made by a panel of judges, which takes the influence of the investigation away from the administration. So this time, Janet Reno made the choice, and she picked a special counsel named Robert Fisk. The fact that he had no legal authorization apparently didn't matter to Robert Fisk, because he took the office of independent counsel and he used the title of independent counsel. And he used their stationery. Now, imagine if you or me were to set up an office in a hallway in Congress and declare that we're the senator from Nevada or the congressman from California and handed out business cards. We might be laughed at. We probably could be arrested. But no one seemed to bother that Fisk was not an independent counsel. Look at Fisk's track record. It's very clear the type of person he was. New York Magazine did a cover story after Fisk's tenure as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. The cover story was entitled, "Why Politicians Never Go to Jail." It said that Robert Fisk had turned New York City into a red light district for political corruption. Get this, in 5 years as U.S. Attorney, Robert Fisk had not prosecuted one politician for corruption. I mean, in New York City, he couldn't find one case of political corruption. This is the man they picked to investigate the Clinton administration in one of the most sensitive cases this century, certainly this half of the century, involving public corruption. And we know what the Fisk investigation eventually did. And as I argue in the book, they misrepresented key evidence. They endorsed this whole White House concocted theory that Foster was depressed. They never did the basic things you need to, like a second autopsy on the death. For example, Fisk said in his report that Foster was so depressed, the evidence of this was that he lost a lot of weight. And it was noticeable to many of the people around him. Well, as one of the independent researchers in this case, who's here with us today, Hugh Sprunt, noted in going through the medical records, in fact, Foster had gained weight while working at the White House. His autopsy shows him 3 pounds heavier than the time his doctor had weighed him in just before he left for Washington. In fact, the FBI documents in the Fisk report, or that were later released after the Fisk report, showed no one noticed really any unusual weight loss. In fact, Foster's wife specifically told the FBI in her statement if there was any weight loss, it was before he arrived at the White House because he was on a diet and exercise program. Who was the main person Robert Fisk to use to buttress his argument that Foster was depressed? Webster Hubbell, who at the same time was under investigation by Fisk, who was preparing indictments against Webster Hubbell for charges of tax evasion and mail fraud. Obviously, they couldn't use Hubbell later because in the Starr report, because Hubbell, again, was refusing to cooperate with prosecutors. He even reneged on his plea agreement with the independent counsel's office. Starr is eventually takes Fisk's place when the law for the independent counsel is authorized. Starr really was an independent counsel, believe it or not. And one of the reasons I believe Fisk was forced out of his position was his handling of the Foster matter, where you had Fisk issuing this report that was very tendentious. The judges knew that there was a problem. They appointed Starr. The problem with Kenneth Starr was he had already been on Janet Reno's short list and one of the strong considerations to take the job Fisk was supposed to have. And I think looking back, we can see why he was on that short list. As I discuss in the book, Kenneth Starr is not the tough, independent prosecutor we have been told he is. Who tells us that Ken Starr is the tough, independent prosecutor? Kenneth Starr and the White House and James Carville. They have created him into being this meanie, this guy that's out to get the Clintons. Why? Well, one reason could be that at the end of the day, Kenneth Starr has been clearing them of the major matters in the investigation, and certainly in the most serious ones affecting their presidency. There have been no indictments to date brought in Washington, and evidence of this is, of course, his work on the Foster case. Starr comes in, and the first thing he does as independent counsel is he hires a very liberal Democrat named Mark Toohey, who is closely associated, according to the Washington Post, with the Clinton White House, who even had thrown a party at his home for Janet Reno. He's made the deputy over all the Washington side of the inquiry, including Foster's death. Now, I have no problem with a liberal Democrat handling this case as long as he has a record and the ability and the willingness to properly prosecute it. But what we see was there was not any of those characteristics with Mark Toohey. In fact, Starr hires I think would be undoubtedly is a liberal, to handle the specific issue of Vince Foster's case, a young civil rights attorney from Sacramento named Miguel Rodriguez. Now, Miguel is an interesting character. He's the only federal prosecutor with a ponytail. He is a little bit of a bohemian among law enforcement types. He also has a very strong background, as I said, in civil rights. Not your typical FBI Quantico graduate out of the J. Edgar Hoover School of Law Enforcement. Miguel comes into the case and looks at it as anyone should who's a prosecutor. What does the evidence show? And he says to himself, my God, this might be a murder, but at the very least, there was a police and official cover-up based on the evidence and documents that were put together by the Fisk investigators. Starr didn't want to have anything to do with Rodriguez pursuing this. Eventually, Rodriguez, as I describe, after some climactic fights and battles in the grand jury, in one case where he and Toohey had a fight, a chair went flying across a room that was adjoining to the grand jury proceedings. Rodriguez and his assistant, two people, resigned from the investigation. Starr and Toohey then had a problem because there's a credibility problem. Your chief investigator or prosecutor resigns. So they did what they've done all along. They picked the right people to help close the case. Who did they pick? In the middle of the O.J. Simpson case, Henry Lee, the forensic scientist from Connecticut, was working on that case to help O.J. get off on murder one charges. Kenneth Starr reaches out to him and asks him to come in to help prove that Vincent Foster committed suicide. In addition, they needed someone to review the pathological findings, especially because there's so many questions, evidence of wrongdoing with the body, additional wounds, and of course, there was no x-rays. Who do they hire? They go to San Diego, they get the medical examiner there, a very competent medical examiner named Dr. Brian Blackburn. The only problem is Dr. Blackburn is the former deputy and good friend of the lead pathologist who concluded the case, ruled on the case as a suicide for Robert Fisk. Obviously, they were circling the wagons. They were getting people they knew and trusted to review the case. And in fact, at long last, when Starr released his report, We knew what the official investigators had been doing all along was confirmed. Things I predicted, by the way, in my book, The Strange Death of Vincent Foster, that they would be busy altering evidence, manipulating evidence, manufacturing evidence, changing evidence, burying evidence. Now, this seems maybe harsh, but it's there in black and white what has happened. For example, it has been cited numerous times that there was no coherent soil found on Foster's shoes when the FBI first examined them in 1994. It was key evidence to prove he had not walked 800 feet through the dirt trails of Fort Marcy Park. I even have photographs of the different areas he would have had to walk over. It's clearly areas of dirt trails to get to the spot where he was found. The body had apparently been moved. And obviously, STARS people thought this was a problem too. So they had Dr. Lee re-examine the shoes. You notice whenever there's evidence of foul play, it always has to be re-examined and re-investigated. And this is a pattern that we see in the STAR investigation. What happens is Dr. Lee suddenly now finds soil on the shoes, something the FBI couldn't do with microscopes. Just to show you, I spoke to the head of the FBI lab, John Hicks, who was in the head of the lab at the time the shoes were first tested. He said what they do is the FBI scrapes the shoes with wire brushes, gets every matter of debris, puts it under microscopes. They go back under the shoe, take the shoes under microscopes again to see if they missed anything. Microscopes of 30 to 100 degree power. Now Dr. Lee is saying not only was there soil, there were smears of soil on the shoes, visible to the naked eye. How big of an elephant do they want the American people to swallow? I suggested at the end of the STAR report they have a little form you send in $1,000, you can buy the Brooklyn Bridge. Then you have the changes, or the Dr. Lee saying he saw blood on the leaves. 20 people at the death scene, no one observed any blood above Foster's head as his body was lying there. Well, if the government claims that Foster blew a large part of his head right here above the back of the cranium, there should have been, according to several experts, blood, brain tissue, bone matter, visible, apparent, typical of a gunshot exit wound. There wasn't. 2 people specifically mentioned there was no blood, the medical examiner on the scene and the lead police investigator on the leaves. This was, again, evidence the body was moved. Dr. Lee has now reviewed Polaroids, not even good crime scene photos, Polaroids, and now says he sees blood on the leaves that 20 people on the scene could not find. I guess he also thinks O.J. Simpson is not guilty still to this day. The point here is that there was now reinterpretation of evidence to make it less consistent with a possible murder theory or a possible theory the body had been moved. FBI agents apparently were busy at work getting people to change their stories. Richard Arthur was the paramedic at the death scene, one of the first paramedics. And Richard Arthur said several times in interviews, and this is a quote from his first FBI interview statement. Arthur, quote, noted that what appeared to be a small caliber bullet hole in Foster's neck on the right side just under the jawline, about halfway between the ear and the tip of the chin. So right here, he sees a hole. Arthur is interviewed again by the FBI during the Fisk investigation. He sticks to his story. He's put under oath by the Senate committee. We have his sworn deposition. He says, I saw a bullet hole. No question about it. There's a Polaroid that shows an apparent wound or trauma. The FBI is saying it's a bloodstain, but it's exactly where Arthur says he saw this wound. Arthur is again put under oath in 1995 when Rodriguez has grand jury proceedings into the death. Do you know what they're claiming now? That Starr re-interviewed with the FBI, no less, Arthur in 1996 for the 5th time. He now says he's not sure and it might not have been a wound. One of the most stunning changes, I believe, that shows the degree that this whole thing has been covered up was the change in testimony of Lisa Foster, Foster's widow. Lisa Foster said in previous investigations that she could not identify the gun that was found in Foster's hand. He was found with a gun he apparently did not own. No one in the family could link him to the gun. It had none of his fingerprints, no apparent blood on it. This was a smoking gun, so to speak, in the whole case. And Lisa Foster told the FBI and told the Park Police after reviewing a photo that it was not his gun because he only owned a silver revolver. Silver. This one was black. She was shown the gun by the FBI in 1994 under Robert Fisk, and she said to them he owned a silver revolver, not the black one they were showing her. For the Starr investigation, the Starr report says that Lisa Foster is now able to identify and is pretty sure that that was the gun her husband owned. Now, I think that this is, suddenly to have a recollection and a revelation, a gun that her own children still says they can't identify as his. And Starr conveniently leaves out of his report the FBI statement of Lee Bowman. Bowman was Foster's nephew, the grandson of Foster's father, who was intimately connected with the father's gun collection. Starr makes the case that this gun apparently came from the father's gun collection. Bowman told them point blank it was not the grandfather's gun. He had store-bought guns, not old antique revolvers, and that was not one of them. That's not in the Starr report either. Why would Lisa Foster change the story? Why would Mrs. Foster, and this is a problem that the press has cited frequently, that this shouldn't be looked into because Mrs. Foster says she wants it to remain a mystery. Well, to me, as a journalist, it raises immediate suspicions because usually family wants the thing investigated properly. In this case, you don't have that. There have been published allegations by the Arkansas State Troopers that Vincent Foster, her husband, and Hillary Rodham Clinton had an affair, had a romantic affair. And I discuss this in the book. And I discuss it not because I want to be a tabloid journalist, but because you have a high federal official's death, you have something obviously the widow might not like being made public, that has been published, where the Trooper Larry Patterson said at various parties he saw them encountering each other in ways only consistent with them having an affair. Other troopers have made similar allegations. You also have a situation, as I discuss in the book, that there was an apparent breakup in whatever relationship they had in the weeks before the death. In fact, Hillary Clinton herself has admitted that 6 weeks before the death, during the 6-week period before the death, she had not spoken to Foster once. Rather incredible, considering their offices were near to one another. Rather incredible because he was working on all their business matters, trying to close the blind trust, the tax papers. There is something very unusual about that breakup. I believe ultimately my book is not about a cover-up of a death. The strange death of Vincent Foster is a warning call to America. It says, if this can happen in America, we are all in trouble. There are many books that could be written about this administration on abuse of power. Waco, the Filegate FBI abuses, the fundraising gate scandal, the Whitewater matter, the Paula Jones matter. My book is the first book in 5 years to detail any one of those scandals from a major publisher. And it's saying to America, if you believe 300 pages, if you accept the media's claims that this is just right-wing conspiracy nonsense, then there's no help that can be given for you. But I think there are many millions of Americans. That one-time CNN poll showed the heartland of America agrees they want a full accounting, because if you can have a death covered up with no accountability, then we're walking down a very dangerous path where all of us are in jeopardy and all of our civil liberties are threatened. So I want to thank you today for coming. I want to open the floor to questions. Any questions? Mr. Sprunt, and we're going to get the microphone over to you there.
This is a very minor point, but one of the things that I noticed when I read Mr. Starr's report is, unless I missed it, not only does Starr's name not appear on it anywhere, neither does any other individual in his office. And I contrast that with Fisk's report, which I think bore Mr. Fisk's name and I believe 3 other gentlemen's name. That just kind of struck me as a little unusual. Did you have any comment on that?
Well, I think it can be easily explained that no one wants to be connected with this. And I think the report ultimately is going to be a great, great embarrassment. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, maybe not next year. History will look at the evidence in this case. There is a body there that may someday be exhumed, and I think that that's going to be a very chilling indictment of the official investigators. So I could see why, for good reason. I was a little surprised. I was looking for at least some of them to be named, but they were very careful not to put anyone's name on it. And I think that's a sign, too, that Starr, you think he would want to say, put his name on the report, but he didn't, and none of the prosecutors did either. Yes, Mr. Tappan?
Yes. Could you discuss what you think the significance is of the fact that the three-judge panel, who had it within their power to decide not only whether the report would be released, but whether there would be any attachments to it of statements by interested parties, people who had been mentioned in the report, do you think there's any significance to the fact that they included a statement by a witness who claims that he saw suspicious-looking individuals in the park when he happened in there around the time of Vince Foster's death?
Yes. In fact, what you're referring to is a 20-page addendum to the Starr report prepared by an attorney for one of the witnesses who is not mentioned by name. And I might add, what Starr did was something rather clever. Instead of mentioning any of the witnesses by name, he listed them as confidential witnesses with numbers. So confidential witness 1, confidential witness 2, throughout the report. And he said he didn't want to invade any of their privacy, but by doing that, he also kept them out of reviewing the report to see it and to examine it before it was released by the judges, because there was a comment period where anyone mentioned in the report would be allowed to review it and comment on it. And so therefore none of the witnesses, key witnesses, were given the opportunity because they were all listed as confidential witnesses. How convenient. The one witness who knew he was going to be mentioned in the report petitioned the judge. His name was Patrick Knowlton. He is one of the earliest people to come into Fort Marcy Park on the evening of the death. And Knowlton was very interested in seeing his mention or how he was mentioned in the report. Starr didn't want him to review the report. So they went before the court, and the court ordered Starr to allow him to review the report. There are apparently 7 different legal motions, including the ones where Knowlton was trying to get his attorney an addendum added to the report. 7 times Starr asked for the judges not to consider Knowlton's appeal. 7 times the judges ruled unanimously against Starr. And I think it's a very clear slap in the face when you have these unanimous decisions, and very clear that Starr wanted to prevent this information coming out. And Knowlton says very clearly that Starr left out of the report the FBI statements, original statements of 2 witnesses that came into the park that evening, a couple, a man and a woman that drove into the park. And the couple stated to the FBI that when they drove into the park just about a half hour before the body was found, there was a man, possibly bare-chested, sitting in the Honda the government has identified as Foster's. The couple pulled in and backed in down in one of the spots in the parking lot. Now, this is a very small lot, Fort Marcy. And about 10 minutes later, the male member of the couple looked over at the Honda and saw a man with long blonde hair and a beard standing in front of the Honda with the hood of the Honda up. Now, this is just a half hour before Foster's body is found. Robert Fisk, when he wrote his report about this couple, he said they came into the park and they, quote, observed nothing unusual, unquote. Well, of course there's nothing unusual about 2 men in and around a car in a public park with the hood up, unless, of course, the person that owns the car is lying dead in the back of the park. Then it's a sign of foul play. This is another piece of evidence. They were burying evidence. They were afraid of evidence that was inconsistent with their theory that Foster drove to the park. I mean, if he had driven to the park, his car keys should have been found on his body. As you, Sprunt, first pointed out, when the park police came, they searched his pockets meticulously looking for a suicide note, no keys. They searched his car, no keys. The keys mysteriously show up in the hospital morgue that night after White House officials come to identify the body. Not 1 set, but 2 sets of keys. The keys were obviously planted by someone on the body later that night. Jonathan?
Yes, I read The Strange Death of Vincent Foster and then found it so compelling I read it again. And so from that I have 2 questions. One is a very specific question, and the other is more an opinion type question. The first question is, In the account that you just gave and in what I read in the book, there were clear examples of people changing stories. And does not the independent counsel have authority to subject people to subpoena people and to have them testify under oath? And why, if so, was or wasn't that used? And what about perjury in that case? I'll just mention the second question now that you can then respond to. And that's that back when I was in the newspaper business in New York City, we liked to start our reporters on the Metro desk on the police beat because they got real, down-to-earth, street smart, follow the evidence, learn what reporting is all about type of training. Your book is one that clearly reflects an ability and a willingness and a tenacity to not speculate about somebody's political position or policy issues, but really follow the evidence. And I think you might have said something in the book, or somebody has said something about why maybe the Washington establishment didn't follow this story the way you did. Do you think it's possible they just don't have that kind of training to follow evidence and follow that kind of path?
I wish it was that easy, simple. But in answer to your first question, why weren't these people put under oath? They're changing their story. Well, it's harder to get people to change their story when they are put under oath. So if we assume, so your question comes from the assumption the official investigators want to get at the truth. The assumption I think the book shows is that they wanted to change the stories themselves. When Fisk comes along, he puts no one under oath, allowing the FBI to do witness statements and prepare the statements. And as I show in the book, it gives the FBI agents working for him tremendous latitude to engage in the cover-up by spinning the statements and spinning the way the interviews are written out about what the witnesses saw. And we know in several cases where witnesses have been shown their statements, not only Patrick Knowlton, Susan Thomasis, who was a Clinton confidant, testified before Congress that somehow the FBI just got her statement wrong too. And there are many of these examples. But what's interesting is when it's pointed out that Fisk didn't use a grand jury, Starr used one, or at least he pretended he used one. What they did was they didn't like the information they got in the grand jury. Starr went back and had FBI agents re-interview people, which is going to be, history will write just how obvious the part of the cover-up this was. They went back and had FBI agents interview the people after they had given sworn information to contradict their sworn testimony. Richard Arthur, for example, had given sworn testimony. They re-interviewed him. Give you another example. Todd Hall was the paramedic that comes and finds the body. He sees a man running away from the body wearing a red vest. He told the FBI that twice in statements in '94. He said it under oath, apparently, in 1995. According to the Starr report, he was interviewed again by the FBI in 1996, and Todd Hall has now changed his story, too. So I think there was an interest to have that changed by the investigators themselves. Secondly, sure, police stories, a lot of reporters don't like covering that. But remember, Watergate started out as a police story. I think Bernstein was the beat reporter for the D.C. police when the Watergate burglary took place, and that's how he got on this story. But somehow, that never stopped the rest of the press from catching on to the other issues that were involved in the Watergate matter. I think there's just been a disinterest here because, for several reasons. The press is led, like herds are, by a few big players, like the Washington Post and the New York Times. They decided early on this was a suicide. They had accepted that story, and they have been immutable since then. Secondly, we all know, it's so obvious you don't even have to say it, the press is very liberal establishment. The Roper study showed 89% of the Washington press corps voted for Bill Clinton in '92. These are people that do not represent America. They apparently have a vested interest in this administration. And it's not that they necessarily want to cover up for Bill Clinton. They just are uninterested and unwilling to examine any of the issues that contradict their preordained version of Bill Clinton. Stephen.
In a very well-documented article in the London Sunday Telegraph, Ambrose Evans Pritchard describes a Polaroid photograph taken at the scene showing a .22 caliber bullet hole in the side of Vince Foster's face.
Yes.
And yet the gun found in his hand was a .38 caliber gun. Is it possible for a 38 caliber gun to fire a 22 caliber bullet, or was there a second gun, or how do you account for it?
The wound would be unaccounted for, I think, by the 38, which apparently was fired through the mouth. So I have no explanation. I should say Ambrose Evans Pritchard was the great journalist from Britain that really looked into the case, and I give him credit for discussing that and breaking 2 other stories related to the Foster death. He did the work that no one in the American media wanted to do, and unfortunately he's been transferred back to London as a routine matter. But I think he's done great service on this story and for the United States. But Ambrose brings up another point, which has been verified by the Starr report, was that the autopsy photos, in addition to the crime scene Polaroid, which showed something there, shows marks on the neck. Starr acknowledges that the autopsy photos show black mark, or at least 2 marks right here on the neck where Arthur said he saw the wound, after the body was cleaned and washed. Starr tells us that based on the photos, they believe that those marks are only dried blood that didn't get washed off. How convenient. Ambrose also did another very important story. He did a story which showed that the state troopers in Arkansas, and I detail this in my book, knew about Foster's death 15 minutes or earlier, well before the White House said they knew of the death, a couple of hours earlier. Because Helen Dickey, Chelsea Clinton's nanny, called the governor's mansion in Arkansas when she heard about the death and said Vince Foster went out to the parking lot and blew his brains out. Trooper at the guard desk there, Roger Perry, put Dickey's call through to the governor, Jim Guy Tucker, and Trooper Perry, who knew Foster, immediately called some of their friends, his friends who knew Foster. He called Trooper Larry Patterson. He called Lynn Davis, the former head of the state police. He called his girlfriend. All have signed sworn affidavits. They knew about the death at least 2 hours before the White House claimed. Trooper Patterson says he knows the exact time because he just walked in the door from work, which was 6 o'clock Washington time, 15 minutes before the body was found in the park. How does Starr address this problem in his report? Very interesting. He says Dickey's telling the truth. One of the things he cites is that she wrote a diary entry a few days after the death. A diary entry is going against the witness statements, okay? Then he says we can't find the one phone record that she admittedly made. She said she made it later that night. They can't find that one phone record at the White House. They don't keep a record from the phone. All the other calls she made, they can find the phone record, but she apparently went through a different system just for that one call to Arkansas, so there was no record. The governor's mansion, I'm told, has phone records of Governor Tucker calling back the White House. Those phone records are now missing. Trooper Patterson told me yesterday, and I reported in my book that the Starr people had been trying to get them to change their story about the time they were notified to make it fit with the White House. Trooper Patterson told me yesterday the FBI working for Starr called him 5 times to try to get him, interviewed him 5 times to try to get him to change his story. And he says, I've been in law enforcement. I've never seen anything like this before. He was consistent. They kept on saying, could it have been? Could you have forgotten? Maybe you were mistaken. And he said, no, I'm not. And what did Starr do? He says, I believe Helen Dickey, and just conveniently leaves out the testimony of Patterson, Davis, and all the others that knew about the death. Any other questions? Jim Davidson, do you have a question?
Well, I think that you're too easy on the FBI, because it seems to me that the implication is that the FBI was used to intimidate witnesses and to change testimony and to suborn perjury and obstruct justice. Misprision of a felony would also fall in there somewhere. It seems to me that there are very serious problems with the whole investigative structure of government, if your book is correct. And I also wonder about your constantly saying that you don't think it was murder, or you're not saying it was murder, because nobody in his right of sound mind could listen to this evidence and not think it was murder, because
Sure.
you have to give some explanation for why, if it's a suicide, they would go to all the trouble to cover it up. Why cover up a suicide? What difference does it make if he shot himself in the White House parking lot, which I don't believe, because that would have been under surveillance, one would think, or somewhere other than Fort Marcy Park. Why would anybody cover up a suicide? Does it matter?
Well, 2 points. I don't think the FBI gets off the hook at all in my book. I make them one of the main culprits. And I've just been discussing how they've changed all the key witness statements working for Fisk and Starr. I believe, and I detail in the book, that William Sessions was fired the day before Foster was found dead in that park, leaving the FBI essentially leaderless on the day and for 6 weeks after the death. Sessions has charged that led to a compromised investigation into the death, and he used that word compromised, by the FBI. I think there has been a political takeover of the FBI that has been unseen of in the country's history. It's gone completely unreported. It should be noted, I don't think it's any coincidence, the first raid by the White House on the FBI background files takes place a week after Vince Foster's death, a week after Bill Sessions was fired as director of the FBI. So I agree with all of your sentiments about the FBI, and I think anyone that comes away from this can see, you know, there's a problem here. Starr knew there was a problem with the FBI. He was told by Rodriguez, and I detail this in the book, not to use the FBI as investigators because of their conflict of interest. You know, you have an independent counsel supposedly outside the executive branch, but they're using as their investigative agents to control the investigation investigators who, if not directly work for the president, will eventually go back and work for the executive branch once in their retirement, and their job status is all dependent on the executive branch of government. It's a silly way to have an independent counsel conduct an investigation. Starr didn't have to use them, and he did, because I think he knew the result they would give. As for murder-suicide, I don't really say I don't know. Maybe that's not, if I said those words, it wasn't appropriate. I should say it's not my job, I believe, to conclude as a journalist working on the case whether it was a murder or suicide. I want to try to be as close as I can to that old-fashioned type journalist that goes out, gets the facts, and presents them, and allows people to draw their own conclusions. Now, I should tell you, and I detail this in the book, that the 2 New York City homicide experts that looked into this case, formerly with the police department there, they lean towards the murder theory, only because all the evidence leans that way. They say they would like to see a second autopsy before they make a final conclusion. But they said murder clearly can't be ruled out in the case. And I also agree with you, and they make that same point, that if this was just a suicide, why to go to all the trouble to cover it up, even if it was an embarrassing situation? And there seemed to be, on the night of the death, a knowledge about this death so early, so soon. And I think reading between the lines, you've got to ask yourself in my book, did the park police know this was to be a suicide before they arrived at the park? And that was the main thing Rodriguez was starting his inquiry at, point zero. How did the police seem to know this was a suicide when they arrived at Fort Marcy? That's extremely disturbing, and I don't think it detracts at all from what you're saying, Jim. Mr. Sprunt?
Further to Jim's point about the FBI, this is something that, as a data diver, I really appreciate Chris being involved with. He was part of a FOIA suit. A FOIA request was denied. A FOIA suit was filed. In March of '96, we obtained 389 pages of the FBI agents' handwritten interview notes, where they would bring in a witness like Patrick Knowlton or whomever, and they would interview him and write up handwritten notes. The FBI 302s, the type witness interview reports, would be done based on those handwritten notes. We freed up, or Chris freed up, it's almost 400 pages, and you can go in and you can see in the handwritten notes, the phrase might be, Mr. Foster was fighting a prescription. The type report will say, fighting depression. A witness will have seen something on the western border of Fort Marcy Park, according to the handwritten notes. The type report, the witness's location is moved to the northeast portion of the park, hundreds of yards away. These are not casual errors. So there is something more involved here. You can see the flow from the handwritten notes to the typed reports. There's a change. Mr. Fisk will often quote, or Mr. Starr will quote, publicly available FBI 302s. If you go back to the 302s, you see a change from the type 302s to what Mr. Fisk says. So you have a progression here. It's kind of a process along the way. You end up with an outcome that is totally unsupported by the raw investigative documents. We got these handwritten notes. They were a treasure trove, right? The agent's handwriting. Handwriting's not so good in many cases, but it's astounding stuff. I mean, I started vibrating when I read them.
But just to follow up, the FOIA suit was a Freedom of Information suit that I filed because Starr was not turning over the handwritten notes of the investigators that was used to later compile what Mr. Spront said with the 302s. That's the official typewritten interview statement. And what they did was apparently things that were on the not in the handwritten notes were included in statements, or they didn't, or they changed words or things and observations that were made in the notes in the later statements. I might add that Foster's doctor has given various stories along the way, because everybody says, oh, his doctor prescribed antidepressant. Well, it's interesting, and they say he was taking this antidepressant. The first blood test that tested for antidepressants found not a trace. It's only later when our friends at the FBI look at the blood does a trace of antidepressant come in. And the doctor originally said in his FBI statement he was not depressed, he was suffering from insomnia. Foster was not in crisis, he didn't think there was a big problem. Now, in the Starr report, the doctor is quoted as saying that Foster was deeply depressed and even anorexic. Now, anorexic, he had a full lunch before he went and allegedly killed himself. Not only that, the medical records show he gained weight, and no one noticed this anorexia, including Webb Hubbell. So, you know, again, is this story a question to be asked, being concocted here? Garnett?
I wondered how all these cover-ups are going to affect the President of the United States as he goes around the world meeting people. Don't they, reading stories about his figure and all that, I should think they'd have so little respect for him. Don't you think that's going to affect our place in the world?
Well, I don't think the foreign press, they sort of mimic the American press, except for Britain, where you have a little bit more interest in going into some of these scandals at the Times and the London Sunday Telegraph, where Ambrose was at. But other than that, they're pretty much unaware, although they hear, I mean, the scandals that we hear about through television, Paula Jones and the fundraising, they're all superficial matters. The press never goes beyond. Now they're arguing about whether Bill Clinton made phone calls from his officer, Al Gore. You know, how have we gotten to the point of these silly phone calls, which they know are never going to really affect Bill Clinton legally or bring any indictments, to the issue of hundreds of thousands of dollars that came from the Chinese government that they can prove in wire transfers, where there's possible espionage going on the highest levels from the Chinese government to influence the elections. And this has completely been dropped by the press here and the foreign press as well. Where it hurts is ultimately any society that has no accountability goes bankrupt, its institutions itself, and just like a business. And I think that's what's going to happen here. Jim, and then Ethan.
Can you help me out with the way that Starr treats a couple of things which seem to me to be beyond physical reality? For example, as I understand it, they've never found any Foster's fingerprints on this pistol that he's alleged to have used to shoot himself, which would be surprising because the condition should have been ideal for fingerprints. A moist day in July in a dusty place, you should be able to leave fingerprints on a pistol. And there were other fingerprints found on the gun when they took the handles that removed part of the grip, as I understand, under the grip, so the fingerprints did adhere to the surface. And he also, as I understand it, the pattern of powder burns on Foster's hands indicate that both hands were forward of the cylinder when the gun was fired, which would have indicated to me that he must be saying that he somehow picked up the gun without putting fingerprints on it, without having his hand on the handle, and somehow fired the gun with his thumb with both hands basically on the barrel of the gun.
Well, you're right on both points that you raise.
Isn't that contrary to physical reality?
Well, both are inconsistent with the suicide and the way they say he killed himself. Let's remember, Foster was found with the gun in his hand. There should have been prints on it. What Starr has done is he got the famous O.J. Simpson expert Henry Lee to come in and say, well, the hand grips have a design on them that has a coarse surface, and that sometimes it's hard to leave a print on those surfaces. And that is true, but what they neglect to mention is most guns have a coarse surface there on the hand grips. That doesn't stop fingerprints from being left not only there, but on all parts of the gun, because no one just touches the hand grips. In fact, we know that based on the powder burns, neither hand was on the grip when the gun was fired. That the hands were up around the frame of the gun, around the cylinder. There should have been, according to the top forensic fingerprint person in the country, looked into this case independently, Vincent Scalise, who I might add found one of the partial print of Lee Harvey Oswald on the rifle that was found in the book depository when he worked for the House Committee on Assassinations. Scalise says, as you said, the conditions were ideal. There should have been partial prints and full prints all over the gun. When he checked the bullets to see if that they were there, the cylinder, the frame, the trigger guard, nothing was found. It was just like the suicide note that I guess Vince Foster wrote with his gloves in the middle of a summer day and then tore it into 28 pieces so he wouldn't leave any fingerprints. The second point you raised were the powder burns. And Starr knew that this was a problem, and all he does in his report is he quotes an expert saying, essentially, we're right. There were heavy powder burns on the left index finger and on the right index finger, meaning both hands were near the only place that those powder burns could have come from, which is the front of the gun, the front cylinder of the gun, the gap between the barrel and the cylinder up near the front, not the back of the gun. Neither hand was on the gun's grip. How do you fire a gun without having any stabilization on the back grip of the gun? And all his report does is state that both hands were up by the front of the gun, near the cylinder gap. So again, this is, according to 7 leading experts, inconsistent with suicide.
Reality. I mean, how could you hold a gun without, you're touching it in a part, presumably he must have been touching the gun at some place. How could you be touching the gun up there where the fingerprints should really adhere without leaving any fingerprints?
Dr. Vincent DeMeo, the leading gunshot expert in the country, said that he had never heard of this and it was inconsistent. An FBI expert said it was inconsistent with reality, as you said. Massad Ayoob of the Lethal Force Institute said, you know what it sounded like to him? Somebody took a gun and put it in a dead man's hands, put Foster's hands around the gun and fired it because they knew the first thing the police would look for, other investigators, would be powder burns. So they made sure there were powder burns by firing a gun in his hands to give the appearance of burns, but on closer inspection, it was an unusual grip, so much so that even the Park Police, and I quote the 2 investigators saying that it was an odd grip, they've never heard of a grip like this. The police themselves. Steve?
2 quick questions then. If a scenario took place as you've just described, and that that gun was fired through Foster's mouth after he was already dead, would there then be a lot of brain matter, tissue, and blood behind the head on the leaves? And because none was found. And secondly, if there were powder burns on both hands, how is it possible that a man who has just shot himself then conveniently rearranged his body so that his hand was down by the side of his knee, as shown in the ABC News photograph?
Well, I think you're right. There should have been blood and brain tissue in it because you have an exit wound. Even though Foster's dead, there's still blood in his body if the shot was fired. There should have been a lot more had he been alive because the heart engorges the head in blood. And we know very vividly there was a case where a gentleman called a press conference in Pennsylvania, state official, and I detail this in the book, shot himself in a way they say Foster did. And what we saw is tremendous amount of blood loss. The head was still above his shoulders when he was thrown back against the wall. And you can see on the video for almost a minute or longer, blood pumping out. How is it there was no blood from bleeding on the front of Foster's shirt? Later some drains on from the back, but none on. Did he wear a bib to keep himself clean and then neatly compose himself? It makes no sense whatsoever. Robert Morton?
I've not finished reading your book, but there were 2 cannons in the park, Fort Marcy Park. And I guess the official report was he was found near the second cannon, which is near the road where there are some residences. Where there's other indications he was actually found near the first cannon, which was fairly remote as far as the eye could see at that point. Have you or any other follow-up investigations surveyed the people who lived along that road? Was there any report of any unusual activity on that day by those residents?
Well, none of them were questioned. No one living in the neighborhood, and there's houses right across from the street where the police found the body. And as you know from my book, I also contend the police haven't told us the truth, that the place was somewhere else in the park. That's in dispute because we have no photos that show where the body was found. At the site in front of the second cannon where the body was found, there's at least 4 different official positions where the body was found. 4 different. One has it, the park police said the body was essentially 18 feet in front of the cannon's barrel down the slope. But when Fisk came along, he realized that was a problem, because if the body was way down the slope, it didn't fit with the witness statements that said it was up near the top. So Fisk just moved the body up in his diagram 6 feet, essentially altered a crime scene diagram, which is, I believe, or understand to be illegal. The neighbors across the street should have been interviewed by the park police. Their manual says for suicides that the neighbors should be interviewed. They weren't. Then Fisk comes along. He interviews only the Saudi Arabian ambassador's residential staff, who are literally across the street, and they have high-tech security cameras and things like that. They claim they saw nothing suspicious. And it took almost 2 years for Starr to go out after the death to interview the neighbors. And the problem is that when you go out that late and suddenly start interviewing people about what happened 2 years ago, you're going to get a lot less information had you gone out within hours of the day after and said, did you see anyone around the neighborhood yesterday? Did you see a van? Did you see people walking in the park carrying anything? Was there a truck in the back? Because people say, well, Mike Wallace raised this point on 60 Minutes. He said, how could anyone carry 200 pounds to the back of the park? And I said, well, Mike, that's pretty easy, because they carried the body, 2 people carried the body out of the park. And of course, that answer didn't get on 60 Minutes. But then I said to Mike, there are trails where the maintenance pickups, and you could drive a car literally without a problem to the back area of the park. The trails are that wide, and it could be done easily. Ethan?
You mentioned some of the impediments to your investigation, the FBI being politically compromised, and I agree with that. A lot of other ones, too. But there is a Republican Congress in place. If there was a possible murder, obviously that's a kind of political anarchy that is injected into the situation, which maybe neither party wants to recognize or examine. But in general, has the Republican Congress been a help to your investigation? And if they've been a help, how?
Well, no, they haven't been a help to me. It isn't like I've been working with them either. I do an independent investigation. Have they done any of their really own investigations? They did one for the Senate Banking Committee, and this has been widely cited, but it really amounted to 1 day of testimony, and they only interviewed about a dozen or half dozen people. It's not really an investigation. It was just a cursory review of the facts. And as I pointed out, when people like Cyril Wecht gave them evidence to the contrary, they didn't include it in their report. I think there was a desire here not to rock the boat early on. Then you have the strange situation after the Senate agrees that there's nothing to this death. A year later, Senator D'Amato's quoted on several public appearances saying that he thought the body was moved and there was good questions to indicate that it had been moved. You have Newt Gingrich saying in the summer of '95 that he wasn't accepting the suicide conclusion. Some people argue a lot of his problems, real problems, begin then with the press. We know there was one congressman that really tried to speak out on this, believed that at least the body had been moved. His name was Dan Burton. And he has been completely excoriated by the press. The Washington Post has written some really nasty pieces about him. No politician likes bad press. More than that, he became chairman of the Oversight Committee. Within days of allegations that suddenly arose that he had engaged in improper financing, they had a major grand jury investigation. I think that's still ongoing. Indictments could be still being hung over his head. And I think that people know that this is a hot potato, very radioactive, and the White House doesn't want people looking into it. So even the Republicans, like many other issues involving Clinton, have not delved into. I think that's going to end our program today. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate the C-SPAN audience for being with us today. And I hope people would get a copy of my book, The Strange Death of Vincent Foster, which is published by Free Press and available in bookstores across America. I'm told that people have had a hard time getting the book, even though it is by a major publisher. If your retailer or bookstore says that it's not available or out of print or whatever, just order the book. It should only take 2 or 3 days to get to you. Even bookstores don't like this truth sometimes getting to you, and it certainly is stuff that goes against the grain of establishment thinking. But I appreciate you coming and have an open mind, and I hope you'll, if you haven't read the book, read it and come to your own conclusions about what happened with Vincent Foster. Thank you.